In November of 2024, Dr. Ian Butterworth and I published a podcast conversation on disinformation. Should we be worried? That raised so many questions for me in terms of why this is a problem and what we can do to help people navigate the post truth era. So I was thrilled to invite Donald Barclay to the show. He's authored numerous articles and books about information and critical thinking, and in particular, in 2022, wrote a book called Disinformation. Having worked as an academic librarian and archivist in universities in the US, Donald is an expert on this topic, and this was such an insightful conversation for me. I hope you enjoy it too. Well, hello, Donald. Nice to see you. And we've had a bit of a conversation, so we've spent some time already, but fantastic for you to be here. And I'm so grateful for your time. I'm really interested in the topic that we're going to talk about, and I know this is a bit of a mission for you as well. So, disinformation. How did you get interested in this topic? You've written a book, so there's a passion
Mm,
there. How
Yeah.
did that come to you?
Okay. Well, thank you for having me, Josephine, by the way. I appreciate being asked to talk. Well, I became a librarian, an academic librarian, starting in 1990 when I started my professional career. Part of my job right from the beginning was teaching students how to think about information, how to think critically about information, what makes, information more or less credible. And, at the time, you're talking to, 1990, so students who were most of their assignments that would involve research were writing papers. That's not true anymore. Now they do presentations, and they do a lot more group work, and they do, slideshows, and they do videos. I mean, it's really changed. The idea of, the only thing you're going to research is a paper. That's one thing that's changed is the output. Although they still write papers. And then, but back in 1990, even then, you wanted students to think about information, about, what's the best information, what's the most credible information. And, in 1990, you could say, well, okay, well, you've got the library here at the university, and, you can go in the periodical room, and there are these things called journals, and this is what they look like, and you're probably going to find good information there. And then there's books, and some books are scholarly and some aren't, and here's how you can tell the difference. And, in magazines and newspapers, they're different from journals. This is the difference. I mean, that was kind of a crude way to teach people to think about information, but it was pretty clear cut. Okay, it's not that way anymore. Nobody uses paper journals anymore. All the journals are online. It's hard to tell. It's bad enough that you have completely uncredible information out there where people are just basically making stuff up, whether accidentally or intentionally. But you've got things like
Mm,
predatory journals, which look like real journals, but they don't really do the peer review and the editing that a real journal does. So if you don't know, you really can't tell the difference. It looks like a journal article, but it's out there floating in space with all the good journal articles. That's just one complication of, you know, information in the digital age. So it's got a lot more complex over time. And then, so I wrote a book. I'd written some books about library kind of topics, but I wrote a book about information called Fake News, Propaganda, and Plain Old Lies, which was published in 2017, right? And 2016, 2017. That was sort of spurred by all the talk about fake news. And that book was sort of a kind of a practical guide to sort of saying, these are ways you can think about information, and these how you can avoid, can you recognize conspiracy theories and how to avoid them? Can you
right.
try to tell the difference between good information and bad? It's more practical oriented. I talked about things like logical fallacies. These are things to watch out for, ways people can try to
Yeah.
convince you of something that don't really hold up. And that book was, the audience for that, I think, would have been like people in the first year of university, maybe taking a communications or a writing course, might have
Hmm.
been from, or even, high school in the United States, high school, I'm not sure what they call it in Australia, sixth form or something, students
Yeah. Year 12.
uh, would have, could have used that book. And then after I wrote that book, I did another one called Disinformation, which is the book we're talking about today. And disinformation is less practically oriented. It's not so much about how to, but it's more kind of philosophical about what's going on with information. Why has it become so complicated? What are some of the things we're looking at? It has to do, I think, a lot with the technology, of course, in part because the technology is simply made so much more information available. We've got so much more to plow through. Again, the technology makes it harder to tell credible from uncredible information because they can look very much the same. You might see something that looks like it's from an official government agency, and then you poke into it and you go, oh no, somebody just made this up and put, some ministerial seal on it, and it looks like it's from
Yes.
the Australian Ministry of Agriculture, and it's not.
Yeah.
So it can be really difficult. So you've got this plenty, and then you've got, you've always had propaganda, but digital technology has made it a lot easier for state operators to create disinformation intentionally, trying to confuse people, trying to create turmoil. The state that you're aiming to disrupt, whether it's the United States or North Korea or whatever, you're sending
Hmm.
information there and trying to get people to distrust the government, to distrust their institutions, and create turmoil, which, if you're trying to destabilize a country, that can really help you. And obviously, the Ukraine and Russia have been fighting. They've been fighting with bullets and bombs, of course, for a couple of years now, unfortunately, but they've been fighting with information too,
Yes.
trying to, the Ukrainians trying to tell the Russians, get out of this stupid Putin's war, quit sending your sons here to die. And of course, the Russians send the opposite information, you're fools to fight us. You should just, give in. And,
Mm.
you know, so anyway, that's, those are all things that are happening. And so I think it's really important for people to be able to think really carefully about information. One of the things I always talk about is people often think about information. Well, there's good information and bad information. I want the good information, but really information's on a continuum. There's very little
Mm.
information that's completely wrong, completely. There's very information that's little that's completely 100% perfectly fact, can't be contradicted, and most of it's in the continuum. And you have to sort of look at where on the continuum is this piece of information, and you have to look at it in context of other information as well. You can't just look at something in isolation. I think something that we have to be aware of in the digital age, it's really easy to fall into this, especially as we can tend to isolate ourselves to just hearing what we want to hear, is it's really easy to drown yourself in negative information about something that maybe you don't care for.
Yes.
So let's say, if you think electric cars are just a boondoggle and a fake and they're terrible, you
Mm-mm.
can surround yourself with nothing but information about what's wrong with electric cars. And there are things that are wrong with electric cars. They aren't perfect. But if you don't listen to what's right with them, and you don't also consider what's wrong with internal combustion cars and
Yeah.
what's right with internal combustion cars, and what about other alternatives like hydrogen or more public transportation or walkable cities, if you don't look at all those things too, you're just looking in isolation of this is what's wrong with electric cars, you can reach conclusions that really don't hold up.
Mm.
It's, and you can point to anything, you can look at crypto. And there certainly are things that seem to be wrong with crypto. I'm not an expert on crypto, by the way, so I don't really know. But you can surround yourself with nothing about negative about crypto. But there's
Exactly.
also, you hear things that are good about crypto. So
That's
you
right.
have to balance that out, and what are the alternatives? What would happen if we got rid of crypto? What would that do to
Yeah.
world economies?
Yeah.
How are we better off with it, better off without it? And those are the kind of questions that are hard to get at and take some
Mm.
thinking and take some open-mindedness, because if you really believe that crypto is the devil's currency, it's really hard to sit there and go, well, I'm going to read this article that says crypto isn't really so bad.
And I think so. All of this goes to our psychological default, which is confirmation
Right.
bias. And
Mhm.
so, and I was just earlier, I was talking to you about the stand up comedian that I really like, and he talks about you need to go beyond the hashtag. There's a book behind the hashtag. And I think
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about too.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
people are surrounded by information in the digital space. It's clipped and it's biased information for a reason. I mean, I think people can freedom of speech is about being creative about and being free to say what you want to say, but it doesn't mean that the listener should stop there. The listener needs to have a more of a critical or open-minded perspective on it. And I think that that's the key. I think it's because you've got less trust in institutions, less trust in science as well. And so I think being critical is difficult when you have less trust. Do you have a view on that, Donald?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, certainly that's part of what disinformation about is the idea of, if all first of all, you're talking about our cognitive biases. We have certain ways we see the world. And one of the things, there's a meme out there, you've probably seen this, the red pill and the blue pill. And the red pill is this view of the world as kind of a Hobbesian view. It's terrible. It's awful. Everything's a danger. Everything's a
Mm-mm.
threat. You got to crush your enemies. And the blue pill is more lock-in. People are basically good. You have to trust people. And,
Mm-mm.
oh, you have to choose between the red and the blue pill. No, you don't, because the world is really neither a red pill nor a blue pill. It's kind of both. And sometimes maybe you have to think more in a red pill mindset. And sometimes you have to think more in a blue pill mindset. But to just lock yourself into one or the other and say one's right and one's wrong, well, that's not right. But our cognitive biases, if we tend to have this Hobbesian view of the world as a really dangerous place, it's really
Mm.
tempting to just say, well, the red pill view is correct. And if we have this Lockean view, the world is basically good. It's really good to go easy to go the other way. And part of the thing about negative information, of course, is that cognitively, in our evolutionary development, our brains were kind of wired to be on the lookout for bad news, right? If you're an early human walking
Yes.
across the savannah and you look out in the grass and that might be a lion out there in the grass, it's better to assume it is and go out of the way to avoid it than to blunder into a lion and get eaten, because the cost of going around is much less than the cost of being eaten, right? So we have this
Yes.
bias towards the negative. And that's why,
Where
you
we're
know,
on the lookout.
right. That's why, they don't send the cameras to the airport in Sydney to report that the 100,000th plane has landed safely. Because, our
Mm-mm.
minds don't. But if a plane crashed at the airport in Sydney, boy, everybody in Australia would be right on that story, right? And why,
Exactly.
and there'd be conspiracy theories about why it happened, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because it is that, we climb onto that negative news. So that's certainly something to be really aware of, that we do have these cognitive biases, and we have to, all of us have them, nobody's immune, certainly not me. And it's really hard to open our minds to saying, okay, what is the real story here? And again,
Mm.
it's always a compromise of, one of the things you hear, I don't know if you hear this in Australia, but you certainly hear it in the United States, all politicians are liars. There's truth to that. They all lie to some extent.
Mm.
They have to, or they get drummed out of office.
That's right.
But here's the other side. They're all telling the truth too, to some
As
extent or
well.
another. And I'm not going to defend the guy. He's horrible. But some of the things Adolf Hitler, the internet's favorite subject, some of the things he said about Germany being unfairly punished for are absolutely true. And now most of the other stuff he said was not
Yes.
true, and he was horrible and terrible and
Yes.
all these bad things. So what we have to do as voters and people trying to have good government is, well, whose truth is really the truest, the closest to reality? Because, as much as we live people will say post-truth world, there are still some facts in the world. If you go to the 17th floor of a building and jump off, you're probably going to die. That's,
Yes.
sorry, I don't care how wishful your thinking is, or who on Instagram told you you'd be okay if you believed strongly enough, or wave pixie dust or something. You're probably going to die if you jump off the 17th floor. It's just a reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to deal with that, and we have to remember that, yeah, it is, we do have to make
Mm.
compromises in deciding, okay, well, what's really the truth? What's really the truth about electric cars? What's really the truth about,
Mm.
in the United States, about gun ownership? Is it real? Are we worse off with them, or would we be better
Yeah.
off without them? Because there are other sides to the story, and one of the arguments that gun owners make is most guns never shoot anybody, and most gun owners never shoot anybody. So why should they be punished for a few crazies? Now, the counter argument is, why do those crazies have guns? Good question. There are
Yeah.
these arguments, that out there. It's sort of like, you could make the same case about, well, almost guns almost affect very few people in the United States. Worldwide, yes, it's bad in the United States, but as the population of the United States, the chance of you being subject to gun violence, although worse than most other countries, is still pretty low. You know,
Mm.
chances are you're not going to get shot in the United States.
Mm-mm. But the fear of that is
But
prevalent.
the fear, yes, the fear of that is real. And again, compared to
Mm.
Japan, your chance of being shot in the United States is much greater. It really is, or Australia or a lot of other countries. So
Yeah.
the question
Exactly.
is, would we be better or worse off without them? And it's a tough decision. And sometimes you have to, and that's why it's a controversial decision. Guns in the United States are a wicked problem. And a wicked problem is one that means there's no easy solution to it. There's no solution that's going to make everybody happy. And
Yeah.
there's a guy, a British uh, academic. His last name is Grint, and he talks about wicked problems. And he's got some great videos about how wicked problems work and why they're hard to solve. And he talks about things like National Health Service in Britain. It's a wicked problem because there's limited resources and unlimited need. How do you decide? And whatever you decide, somebody's going to be unhappy. And what you can't do is you can't solve the problem perfectly, but you can have better and worse solutions. And that's really
And
what information's about, is trying to find a better solution.
yeah. And maybe that's the problem with, I've just had a bit of an insight and I want to check it with you. Maybe that's the problem with what we're getting in digital media. It's quite binary. It's one voice, then another voice, or two voices, bashing it out like debate.
Right.
And these issues actually require dialogue. So more long-form dialogue, but not just like Joe Rogan does with two people, with him driving the conversation.
No.
It actually requires dialogue with a collective of people, or maybe over a period of time, with people maybe going to other sources as well. Am I on something there?
I think so. If in the United States, I don't know if you're familiar with William F. Buckley. He was an American writer and thinker, and he was very conservative. He was a, ultimate right-winger. Back in the day, in the 60s and 70s was kind of his heyday. And he had this program on public television called Firing Line. And he would have a guest, and they would talk about an issue, and they would spend 30 minutes, maybe an hour, talking about one issue. And sometimes they agreed, sometimes they didn't. But it was very thoughtful. I mean, William F. Buckley was a genius. He was a really smart man. But there was no yelling. There was no name calling. There was they weren't cracking jokes all the time to entertain the audience. And, if you go back, you can find Firing Line on YouTube and stuff. And if you watch it, it's boring as hell to our YouTube sensibilities. Like, oh my God, how could anybody stand to watch this? It's so boring. And it is kind of boring, but it's also, they're really getting at some things. And it wasn't about William Buckley winning every time. Sometimes he won, sometimes he didn't. And most of the time it was a draw.
Yeah.
Because they were talking about really complex issues like the war in Vietnam and student protests and, drug use in the United States and, all these kind of things that were the big issues of the 1960s and 70s in the United States, they would really talk about. And there were similar programs on TV, like there's something called Meet the Press, which was on Sunday mornings. Incredibly boring program, but there would be several people talking thoughtfully about something. And I think,
but without the yelling and the clickbait, right?
Right. And also, I think we've gotten to, this has something to do, I think, with the power of popular culture, which I think I see as, and I write about this in my book, the popular culture becoming more economically valuable and more of a force in our culture since the Second World War. It's just getting more and more. And especially if you count sports as part of pop culture, which I do, that pop culture is about entertainment. So Joe Rogan has to be entertaining. Now, some people find him entertaining, some people don't. The late Rush Limbaugh, do you know Rush Limbaugh in Australia?
Yes.
A lot of people, who, if you like his politics, he was incredibly entertaining. And people who love him will talk about how funny he is. And people who hate him go, funny? He wasn't funny at all. He was a big old flaming gas bag. But, people want to be entertained. And I think, not to name any names, but some politicians have gone a long way by entertaining people. And
that's right.
The fact that somebody's entertaining doesn't mean they're going to have good ideas for leading your country. Going back to our friends, the Nazis, I don't know if people know about this, but the Nazis were really big into entertaining their audience. They had lots of quips and humor, which is horrible humor because it was all about killing Jews and stuff. But they had a lot of humor stuff, and that was part of their shtick. Not Hitler so much, but people under Goebbels and stuff. They were always doing cartoons and comics. And
I do remember seeing some
mocking
of those.
the Jews. It was all about entertaining people as well as firing them up to do horrible genocide. So I'm not saying that anybody in today's American, I'm not calling anybody out as a Nazi necessarily, but I am saying that people rely on that entertainment, capability.
And it's part of the propaganda movement, is what you're saying. Right. It's sort of part of the mix of that.
And again, it's part of, I think, of our fixation on pop culture. We just have to be entertained. William F. Buckley talking and another guy talking for half an hour and wearing suits and ties, talking for half an hour about inflation in 1972 is boring. Joe
Yeah.
Rogan getting off some quips, or Patton Oswalt making some jokes about Bush, or about Trump, or that's funny, that's entertaining.
Yes.
Jon
Yeah.
Stewart,
Yeah.
Daily Show, it was very entertaining. Was it
Yes.
substantial? Not really. It was more about getting
That's
in
right.
the dig, and I think
Yeah,
that can come back to
exactly.
bite you. If you're basing your vote on who entertains you the most. What's the movie Gladiator? Russell Crowe, the Australian. Are you not entertained? That's kind of what we're at, where we are.
Let's put them in the pit and watch them. Yeah, exactly. Rip
Right,
each
right,
other apart. There is a show, actually, we have a television broadcast
right,
service in Australia called the ABC, and
right. I've heard of it. Yeah.
they do a show. Yeah, and they do a show called Q&A, and it's
Hmm.
a weekly it's weekly. They invite an audience in, and they usually have a panel, a very representative panel of the issues, so on both sides of the issues, and in between and in the middle. But they have in the audience people who represent parts of the constituency who are maybe affected by that issue.
Right,
So
right,
you're not only hearing from the panel members, the audience get to ask questions and comment as well. And you get this, they don't resolve the issue necessarily, but you get this, it's like a 360 view of an issue,
right,
which is,
right,
and it's very expertly moderated. So it
right.
doesn't
Yeah.
get into, I think it's entertaining because it's so informative, but it's that 360 view that you don't often get in other places. So
No,
I
no.
can see
Right.
the value.
Well, in the United States, we have Fox News, which is conservative, and we have MSNBC, and somebody referred to it as Fox News for vegans. It's they're both preaching to the
Dear.
choir of their and
Yeah.
entertaining, essentially entertaining their audiences, their respective
Yeah.
audiences, and there's not a lot of
Yeah.
crossover between Fox News and MSNBC. People who watch one or the other.
Mm,
And it's interesting. I was talking to
mm.
someone from Germany a couple of years ago about this issue, and he was somebody who is interested in information and so on. And he said, I was asking him about the kind of fake news and that kind of stuff, and he said, well, in Germany we have a public news broadcast that basically runs on state money, not supported by commercials, which both the
Similar to the
NBC and
ABC.
Fox News have to sell cornflakes, right, to stay on the air.
Exactly.
And so he said in Germany we have the state, sponsored news, but it's perceived as very fair and open-minded
Mm.
and representing all kinds of sides. And he says, and people tend to trust it in Germany, so we don't have that problem
Yeah.
so much. A different culture,
Interesting.
of course.
Yeah.
And when you start talking about Germany and information,
And a culture that's really had maybe learnt from its past as well,
yeah,
which is
right,
really
right,
interesting. There's something we need to see there because yeah,
yeah.
it's
And
if
the
we
the
can.
fact about commercials is like one of the most important things I tell people when I'm talking about thinking about information: follow the money. Who's got a money interest in this information?
Yeah.
Because if you have money riding on a certain issue, it's really easy for you to believe that you're right. If you know not to if you're an oil company executive, it's really easy, I believe, to convince yourself that climate change is just a bunch of horse manure. Not that they're necessarily evil or bad or they want the world to die, but it's really easy when you're money and you're sitting there thinking, my income and all these people who work for me and all these people around the world depend on this industry. It's really easy for me to go,
Mm-mm.
yeah, well, that climate change is just, that's just a bunch of liberal made up fake science. It's really easy to go that way.
Mm-mm.
And
Yeah.
by the not to by the same token, if you believe that vegan food is, you're making millions on vegan food, it's really hard for you to go, wait a minute, somebody's saying this vegan product I'm making is not healthy. Well, that can't be true, right? Because I make millions of
Mm-mm.
dollars off of this vegan fake cheese, and somebody's trying to tell me it causes cancer. Are you crazy? I'm not going to believe that. But so money can really drive where people are. You really have to ask yourself, where's the money? What's it? And there was a kind of a little incident it didn't actually make it onto the news report, but there's one of the Fox News anchors. I forget who it was. It was Sean Hannity or one of those guys who's a big celebrity on Fox News, was talking to this Dutch academic about information and so on. And this didn't make it on the Fox News because the Dutch academic said to him, he said, well, but aren't you just a millionaire paid by billionaires? And the host started like dropping F-bombs and got really mad, of course. And you can find it on YouTube, but it didn't make it on the Fox News because he wasn't going to hear it. But there's,
Yeah.
whether you're on MSNBC
Yeah.
or Fox News, if you're a top celebrity, if you're Rachel Maddow, or I think it was actually Tucker Carlson was the guy who got mad, Sean Hannity,
Yeah.
or Rush Limbaugh was a billionaire by the time he died. He had an empire of
Mm,
information, So it's really easy for you to start believing you're right and to stop listening when your livelihood and one of the things I talk about in my book is this idea of this in our world that we live in now. There's this triangle. I'm not making a very good triangle here, but a triangle of, and I see three parts to it. There's money, and there's fame, and there's power. And if you can grab one of
mm,
those and take it far enough, you have a really good chance of getting the other two. And
yeah.
not to pick on the guy, well, I guess I'm picking on him. Donald Trump used his money to get famous, and he used his fame to get power.
Yes.
Whether you like him or
Yes.
not, that's pretty true. I
You
mean,
can see
since
the
the
model. Yeah.
70s, he's been using his money to make himself as famous as he could. He's been trying to be a celebrity and succeeding at being a celebrity
Mm-hmm.
pretty regularly since the 1970s, and he used his money to do it. And eventually he got famous enough that he got powers. It worked for him and other people. And, not everybody does it. You could say, Paul McCartney made money. Well, he got famous and it made him money. He really hasn't grabbed onto the power part, but other than maybe he,
Yes.
makes his opinion knows about vegetarianism. But other than that, he's not
Yeah.
running for prime minister or anything. He probably could. He might get elected if he did, but he not everybody grabs all three of them. But if Paul McCartney
Yes.
wanted to go into British politics, I think he would have a very good shot at it,
That's so true. That is so true.
because he
Absolutely.
has two of the
Donald,
three legs. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Donald, you were talking about science. I wanted to touch on science because earlier, when we first started talking, you talked about predatory journals, and I haven't
Yeah.
heard that term before.
Okay.
So, can you tell me a little bit about that? And also, let's talk a little bit about science because I think there's a lot of disinformation about how science works as well, which then leads to people having less trust in the information that comes from scientific journals, peer-reviewed processes. So can you unpack that for me a little? I
Yeah,
know
I
it's a
can.
big lot of a
Okay.
big
No.
ball to unpack, but
Okay. So back in the print days, if let's say I was a scientist and I wrote an article about microbiology, and I done the research first, and then I write the article. Come up with some new finding, and I submit it to a journal, and it gets
mm-mm,
accepted, and it gets published. The journal agrees to publish it, and probably I have to pay something called page charges, which is an extra fee per page, because that's how they worked, and then it would get published in a journal, and the journal was based on subscriptions, and that's how it worked. Okay,
mm-hmm.
so what happened when journals started going electronic, which happened in the late 90s, and I
Yes.
was working at a medical library as a medical librarian in the late 90s. And when I started working in 98, there were like, this medical library had like 45 journals that were electronic, and the rest was all print. And by the time I left, over 4,000 of them were electronic. That was like 5 years later.
Mm,
Just flipped
yeah.
overnight because my job was wrangling all these journals. So journals went electronic. So it's a big issue about how, the cost of journals, blah, blah, blah. So one of the ways that journals can be funded is something called gold open access. So what that means is if I have a legitimate journal like Cell, which is one of the most prestigious journals in science. So I write a biology article and I submit it to Cell, and they accept it. And I'm like, thank God they accepted it. I'm going to get tenure. My career is made. I got an article in Cell, and Cell goes,
Yeah.
okay, we can publish this article regularly. And that means that only subscribers or people whose library subscribe can access the article. But if you pay us a certain sum of money, $10,000, let's say, we'll publish it open access, which means everybody can read it right from the minute it's published.
Right.
It means more people are going
Right.
to read it, more people are going to cite it.
Yeah.
The more people who cite it, the bigger my
Mm-mm.
prestige.
Media will more likely to pick it up.
I'm more likely to get full professor now instead of just associate. So, okay, and I've got grant money, so I'll pay, right?
Yeah.
You still have to be accepted, a legitimate process. It has to be edited, peer reviewed, all
Yes.
of that, right?
Yeah. And can I just say, Donald, as a past researcher and academic, I went through that process and it's a tough process. I often got rejected. People don't
Hmm.
understand that if they're not in that world. It is tough to even get your article in that journal or
Yeah,
get your paper in that journal because there is a being peer reviewed. It's very tough. Yeah. Yeah,
right.
keep going.
And the other thing, getting a tenure track position at a university, the competition for that, people don't realize if you get a PhD, that's
Huge.
like your first step on maybe possibly getting a
That's
tenure
right.
track job. There's a lot more PhDs than there are tenure track professors out there. It's a very
Yes.
competitive
Yes.
world. Anyway,
Yeah.
again, going back to Cell, very rigorous process. I'm going to pay him the $10,000 or whatever to have my article open access. It's fine. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Good for my career. So what happened was these sort of shifty people out there go, I'm going to create a journal and I'm going to call it Cellular Biology. And actually, that's probably a real journal, but let's say it's a made up title. Cellular
Yeah.
Molecular
Yeah.
Biology. I just make up a title. And what I do is I advertise, hey, we'll publish your article in Cellular Molecular Biology. We'll only charge you $1,500 and you submit it to us and we'll publish it for you. And we'll edit it and we'll peer review it. Well, they don't really edit it. They don't really peer review it. They
And
accept
they
your
don't do the
article, they
peer
accept your
review.
money, and it appears in this thing that looks like a real journal. And especially if you're an
Yeah.
undergraduate, you
You
look at
would
it and go,
know.
well, it's called Cellular Molecular Biology. It must be a good journal. And it looks just like a journal article. It's got citations and
Mm-mm.
everything. Must be a good article, right? So you've got all this. And so here's the weird thing, the hard thing to understand. It's perfectly possible, despite all of the policies and procedures, for a not very good piece of science to get published in Cell. It could happen. It's also possible that somebody could submit an article to a predatory journal like Cellular Molecular Biology, and it's a perfectly good article. It's great
Yeah.
science. But it somehow ended up in this junk journal, making it all the more complicated, right? So it's really
Yeah.
hard to separate this out. And you know, it's so that helps. And unfortunately, that can discredit science because if you have all these articles floating around that look like
That's
they're peer
right.
reviewed, really serious science that are really kind of junky and not very well done, not new findings, it's just junky stuff. And I don't know that this is happening, but I could certainly see if, let's say, a tobacco company decided to start handing out money to scientists saying, publish
Mm.
junk science articles in junk journals saying that smoking's not really bad for you or that vaping is not bad for you. Reach that conclusion and we'll give you a lot of money to do that. And suddenly the market is
Yeah.
flooded with what look like the legitimate article saying vaping, not a problem. Don't worry about it. It's perfectly safe. When it's not, the real science says it's not. And of course, people with agendas can and then go, well, oh, well, look, there's all the science that says vaping is.
And you often hear that. You often hear people with agenda citing research or citing, papers. So what do you do about that, Donald? Like a
Well,
layperson, as in someone who doesn't maybe have access to an academic library or
right,
perhaps professors that they can ask
right.
advice. Like, what do you do?
Well, one of the things you can do, one of the things is to look for the scientific consensus. And so when you talk about climate change, there's no scientific controversy that climate change is happening and it's caused by human activity. It's not a scientific
Yeah,
controversy.
all the
It's a
scientists
political and
agree.
economic controversy. It's not a scientific controversy. There's almost no scientists saying it's not, who really know what's
Yeah,
going on, climate
that's
scientists and
right. Yeah.
people like that. They're not saying it's fake. They're all saying it's real. Very few that are saying other things. And a lot of them, if you scratch them very deeply, you find out, oh, they're getting money from people with interest, right? So
Yes.
now, and you can argue, and now you could certainly make the case, well, nobody knows what's really going to happen at the end of the day. No, we can't say for certain what's going to happen.
Of course. Of
And
course.
and you could make an argument economically, it doesn't make sense for us to try to change this.
Mm.
We're stuck with it. You can make those arguments, but those aren't science arguments. Those are economic and political arguments. They're not
Yes.
science arguments. So it's really hard, but you want to look for scientific consensus. One of the things that you can do if you could, and you can find these out there, and because they can be published open access, and sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, but if they're published open access, it means anybody with access to the internet can read them, is to look for things called review articles and also systematic reviews. And what these are is
Yes.
this is where a scientist is maybe looking at vaping. And the scientists kind of, if they're good, they do the work for you. They look at the quality research on vaping and they say, we looked at all these articles. This is all the articles out there that's been published about the health effects of vaping. And we've done this statistical analysis on the findings. And our conclusion is vaping is probably going to
Yes.
kill you if you do it for more than 5 years. It's going to
Yeah.
destroy your lungs. That's the
Yeah.
scientific consensus, and that's
Hmm.
much better than any one article, and certainly better than somebody on Instagram saying, I've been vaping for 2 years and it hasn't hurt me. And,
That's right. That's right.
one of my uncles, World War II veteran, I've been smoking for 55 years. It hasn't hurt me. He was dead of lung cancer in 6 months. I mean,
No. Oh,
he wasn't going to live forever,
yeah.
but he might have lived 10 more years
No.
longer. And you know who would have liked him to
Yeah.
live 10 more years longer? My aunt would have liked him to live 10 more years longer. I would have
Yeah.
liked him to live
Yeah.
10 more years longer, but he didn't because he basically threw away 10 years of his life by smoking.
Yeah. And there's always individual variations on anything, right? So
Right.
I think often people, especially for example, right now in the with the vaccination controversies going on, I think in particularly in the States, it's a huge debate around polio vaccination right now, which I'm hoping doesn't go the way of repealing free vaccinations, because through vaccination we've pretty much eradicated that disease.
I belong to the Rotary.
However,
I belong to the Rotary Club. We've been trying to eradicate polio for 30 years, and we're almost there. It's just a couple places in the world where there's just a few cases. We're almost done. Anyway, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's almost like if you go back to Star Trek and Spock, who everyone loves, it's, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And that's actually how vaccination works. But you can always find someone who's had an adverse reaction to vaccination, here, there, because there will be individual variation. But I think what you're saying, it's almost like, there's an analogy there with systematic reviews. When we do systematic reviews, and I was actually involved in a few systematic
Right,
reviews. I
right.
used to work in research in public health. And what we would do is we would really look at, what do we know? What is the research that has been published in peer-reviewed journals that we understand right now? But not only that, we're not taking those results at face value. We're reanalyzing those results in a
Exactly. And you're doing
systematic review.
statistical
So it's
analysis.
another look.
Yes, right, right,
Exactly.
right.
Exactly. So that's almost like a double assurance
Mm-hmm.
that you can say, well, based on what we know right now, this is the recommendation.
Right,
And of course, science it's a progressive process. We don't stop when we think we have an answer. Researching
right,
to make sure that that's still the case. And I think that there's a lot of, in some ways, perhaps it's more misinformation about the scientific process as well, right?
right. And one of the things, the other thing about scientific information and scholarly information in general is there are problems with scholarly communication. There are
Yes.
people
Oh,
using bad
yes.
data. There's peer review
Yeah.
problems. There's you can sit
Of
here and talk all
course.
day. Again, the negative, but you have to weigh it against the positive. And the other thing, of course, about science, science is a human activity.
It
Humans are
is.
not perfect, And if your standard is anything less than perfect, I'm rejecting. Well, then you're probably too good for this world. And it's like antibiotics. Every year around the world, antibiotics kill a few people more than anybody wants, but they do. It's a fact. People
Mm,
take
mm,
antibiotics and they die from them. They have a bad reaction. It happens. Should we stop using
mm.
antibiotics? Well, anybody who grew up or even does any reading about before there were antibiotics, that there's a famous story about when penicillin was first developed. There was a British police officer who got scratched on the face, and he got an infection, and they started giving him penicillin, but they ran out and he died. And the story was for years was that he'd scratched himself in his rose garden on a rose thorn.
Oh,
But what came out
okay.
recently was he was hit by a bomb fragment, and the British government didn't want people to know that's why he died, because they didn't want people to know getting scratched by a bomb fragment, just barely scratched on his face, just enough to draw some blood, kill
Yes. Can
you.
you
They didn't want
imagine?
people panicking. So they said it was his rose garden, but later
Mm,
it came out he was actually a bomb fragment because he was like out, patrolling at
yeah.
night when they were bombing,
Yes.
and he got hurt. But um,
That would have been mass
but
panic.
he died because they ran out of penicillin. He didn't die because of penicillin. And one of the things that happened in World War II was in the United States, the Office of Research and Strategic Development. It was the same office that developed the Manhattan Project and the bomb. Early in the war, they figured out how to mass produce penicillin, which had never been done before. And by
Right.
doing that, they saved probably
Mm,
millions of lives of
yeah.
servicemen around the world because they could give them
Mm,
penicillin in the field and they could produce enough of it, and that was a huge breakthrough. But people don't remember, Calvin Coolidge, who was president of the United States, his teenage son played tennis one day without his socks on, got a blister, got an infection, and died of it. President of the United States' son. Before there were antibiotics,
yeah.
people,
Yeah.
people have short memories. And again, if all you focus
Exactly.
on is the negative, oh, this person died because they had a bad reaction to an antibiotic.
Mm,
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Nobody wants that to happen. That's a terrible
no.
thing. Does that mean we should get rid of antibiotics? It's like saying somebody died in a car. Should we get rid of all vehicles? Somebody died in an airplane. Should we quit flying? Well, there's a price to pay for that. There certainly is, and we have
Yes.
to make the best
Exactly.
decision we can.
Yeah. So Donald, we're nearly out of time. I wanted to just get a sense, just to sort of wrap us up here. What are there's probably a few key messages, and we've talked about them, but what do you really hope that people will get from reading the book? What's your mission?
Okay, well, I hope that people will think more about the information they consume. And one of the things is you can't analyze every piece of information down to the nth degree, right? You can't do what people who write a systematic review do, where there's this
Yes.
information there. I'm going to read every article ever written on this topic and come to a logical conclusion about what it means. Because first of all, when you're talking about scientific information, you may not even understand a lot of it, and I certainly don't. When you read a medical article, they talk about something called NNT. It's number needed to treat, and it's a statistical calculation of how many people you have to treat to have the certain effect of and it basically tells how effective a medicine is. But if you don't understand
Right.
what an NNT is, it means nothing. So
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah.
you can't research everything, but you have to think very carefully about things that have a large impact on you and your society, right? And you have to maybe put in the time for things that are really important and impactful in your life and in the lives of people around you and in the
Mm.
society around you. So, for example, the example I give is if I was visiting you in Australia and I opened up my bag and I said, "Here's a candy called an Idaho Spud Bar. It's made in Idaho, and it's in a wrapper." And I said, "It's made by a candy company in Boise, Idaho. It's really delicious. Would you like to try it?" And you don't really know anything about the Idaho Spud Bar, but you kind of know me and you kind of trust me. And it's wrapped and it's from a real candy company. You open it up and you eat it, and maybe you like it, maybe you don't. It's chocolate and marshmallow. Kind of looks like a potato, but not really. That's why they call it the Spud Bar. You know, okay, I didn't really do my research on that. If I came, if I had you over to my house and I said, I cooked up some mushrooms, I found them out in the yard, I think they're
Mm.
okay. You think they're okay, Donald? Maybe I want to do a little more research on these mushrooms you're serving me because we could all end up dead, right? Or at the least, we might end up tripping, or something. What's at risk? And certainly things
Yeah.
like if you're talking about, you know, the entire economy or the entire environmental future of the planet, or
Yeah.
you know, the potential for violence, are you going to go storm the Capitol based on kind of maybe not very good information that you haven't really checked out?
Mm-mm.
You know, um,
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
you going to take a shot at a candidate because you heard some bad things about him? That's a pretty extreme step
Mm.
to take. When you
Yes.
maybe really don't know what you're doing. It's in the United States right now, everybody's talking about the health insurance CEO who was murdered in New York City. You know,
Yes.
um,
Yes.
I mean, sort of your gut reaction is, I hate to say this, a lot of people's gut reaction is the SOB had it coming, right? A billionaire
Yeah.
health insurance guy denying claims. But there's a lot more to it than that. It's a lot more complicated than that, and there's gut reactions, and people are making jokes about it, again, just like, Joe Rogan or Patton Oswalt or Jon Stewart, or, it's great to make a joke
Josephine.
about it. It's funny, it's entertaining, but that's not really a good way to make a
Yeah.
decision on anything
No.
because it
Yeah,
entertains you.
exactly. Exactly. That's right. Absolutely. And I think when that sentiment happens, for me it's really interesting because it's really about going back to what is causing that sentiment, going back into a little bit more detail around, is it about the system that allows for people to maybe have these bad outcomes, and for health insurance companies to make billions of dollars while people are not getting adequate health care. And so to me, there's some really positive things. I mean, it was a tragedy, obviously, but some positive dialogue that could come out of that. But it goes beyond. I mean, I would never make a joke about someone being shot, or
Yeah,
I would
right,
never
right.
say they deserved it.
No,
I mean, that's just, and to me,
no,
that again, it's sort of it feels very binary. It's like,
right.
we were right, he was wrong, that kind of
Well,
idea.
I
Yeah.
mean, and what it really, I mean, I was reading something where someone was talking about this. What they were really saying was the problem is there's something wrong with the way insurance works in the United States, health insurance works, and that's
Yeah,
what needs to be fixed. It's
that's
not
right.
about individuals being bad. It's
Yeah.
about a broken.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's kind of
exactly.
like I don't know, if this happens in Australia, but certainly in the United States, people go, "Oh, those bums in Congress, they're all a bunch of idiots, and you know,
Yes.
they're all fools and idiots," and it's like really because we keep sending smart people to Congress and they all turn out to be idiots. Is it because they're idiots or is it because they're dealing with really hard issues, wicked problems that are not easy to solve? It's sort of like, if you have a raging river and you keep sending people down it in canoes and they keep drowning, are they bad canoeists or is the river really dangerous?
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
maybe the
That's
river's
right.
really
That's right.
dangerous, and it's not the person.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, Donna, is there another book coming? This is number two. Is it number
Well,
three?
well, actually, I've written this is like this disinformation was like 7 or 8, so I've written quite a few, but not all on information. Mostly they're about library management and things like that. But I do have a book coming out, but it's a history of academic libraries in the United States. It's not really about information, so it's kind of a specialized. It's focusing on what happened after 1990 to 2025, basically, of how
Right.
digital technology changed academic libraries in all these really
Interesting.
profound ways.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so it's
To that. That's
well, it's
wonderful. I love libraries.
okay.
So,
Well,
because I spent many years in university
yeah.
libraries.
Well,
So the
oh yeah.
smell and the
Okay. Well, I
smell of periodicals.
yeah. Well, it's when you go in a library and you smell that book smell. You know what that is? That's the smell of paper rotting.
No,
Yeah. Sorry, that's what it is.
that's
It's a
not
great
good.
smell, but
It's
that's what
such
the
a
smell
good
is. Yeah.
smell.
I
All right, we
love it
need to
too.
bottle that and put it in a candle.
But
Yeah.
it really did change the way libraries operated, and
Mm,
and it's in some ways something lost and something gained, right, in everything.
yeah.
But it really changed the way, first of all, how we teach people to think about information. It changed the way we handle
Mm,
information, it changed the economics. One of the great things, I'm babbling on here, but one of the great things that's happened is that all of these like archival collections that were sitting in libraries, and the only way you could access them was to go to the library, go to the archive, and sit there and start pouring through boxes. Well, not
yes.
all of them, but
Yes.
a lot of them are being digitized now. So you can go online and see
Mm-mm.
the photos and read the documents without having to travel to
Mm,
Ohio State
that's
University
great.
or the
Yeah.
University of Florida or the University of Sydney or whatever, to see these things.
Mm-mm.
It's great. It's a great thing. And the more that gets out there,
Mm.
and because they're mostly public domain things, they're all just available for anybody to see. So it's really
And
opening up
history
a
is a
lot of
great teacher.
interesting stuff. Yeah. No,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, Donna, we better stop, otherwise we'll keep
Okay.
babbling.
Well, we'll keep babbling.
Not at
Yeah.
all. It's been.
Okay.
I could keep talking for another hour,
Okay.
but we'll stop there. Thank
Okay.
you so much, Donna. I
Thank you
really
for having me.
appreciate the conversation. It's been wonderful.
If I can say one more thing, I think I'm an optimist. I am
Sure.
an optimist, and I think that we are going through a really tumultuous time because we've had a lot of change inflicted us on a short period of time. I think we as a
That's
people
very
are
true.
going to adjust to it. It'll be a different world, but I think we'll adjust to it. I hope
I
without
like that.
too
I
much
like that
conflict.
worldview. Yeah. I'm going to take that optimism into my day. Thank you,
All right.
Donna.
Okay.
I
All right.
like that.
Thank you so much for inviting me.